As an outflow of your commercial. Before I begin on the third part in the series on environment and regulation, I will take some time to not forget and remind us about our friends, our comrades, our beloved creatures in space and time, the lovely animals that inhabit and populate this earth. And especially take time to remember and feel the deep sorrow, the hollow sorrow for our friends, the animals that are imprisoned in animal laboratories for the stated purpose of being used as tools in research design. In fact, I don't pray, but I could almost take a moment of silence in prayer and hope and just horrible feeling and angst for any creatures having to be in such a predicament. Many of you know that a constant reminder comes from me about animals and their plight, especially animals in the laboratory. And some of you have spoken to me through email by contacting first my website, which does appear at the end of the edited versions of this show. And I'd like to take some time out to make a few statements again about how the thinking is most properly conceived in regard to animals and their being entirely independent and not a proper circumstance or situation for being used as tools in the name of research. Briefly, animals feel pain. Animals are sentient creatures. Animals are life forces, just as are we. In fact, they are such life forces enough that they can even be used as models for what is being so-called studied in the laboratory, because they're enough of a life force to serve as a similar and replicated or substituted entity or precursor entity to finding out things in so-called research. So, being very much like us as living creatures and feeling and knowing and sensing and having physiological parameters, biological parameters, animals feel pain and being incarcerated alone, being in the laboratories, hearing the footsteps of experimenters and technicians coming in, knowing they'll be pulled out of their cages, injected or measured, or having some tissue extirpated, or being given a dose of something that makes them feel ill, or just being in such a cruel circumstance in a cage all day with kinds of activities going about, antiseptic and sterile and hermetically sealed, be they what they may, certainly not the natural habitat nor any kind of a norm for life to be living, and being stuck in that and being at the mercy of intentional hands, that alone, as a matter of great suffering, to say the least, of the physical endurances, some of them infected to degrees that they suffer so greatly and must be even isolated in their misery because of the seriousnesses of the diseases that are inflicted on them. So the first cardinal understanding, the first axiom, the first reality is that animals feel pain. They feel both the behavioral, psychological, experiential phenomenological pain and reality of what is happening to them, which in many instances can be as bad or worse than anything physical, depending on the degree to which physical things are done. And secondly, they decidedly feel physical pain and scream when things hurt them and try to avoid being taken out of their cages and manipulated. Try to avoid being used like pencils in a pencil sharpener. So to that degree, we're on a ground of judgment with a fellow creature that can feel as much and or more as you or I. And those of you who are familiar with domestic animals and pet animals realize how broad, vast, and deep are the psyches and beings of creatures that live in this animal form. So we're talking about an experience of torture, an experience of suffering, an experience of pain, an experience greater than that of what many human beings have had to endure, even ones that are exalted for having sacrificed of themselves in their lifetimes. And here are the poor hapless animals without recourse enduring this, theoretically guilty of nothing, and yet having to withstand such agony. So the judgment is separate from any issues of research whatsoever. The primary judgment is the immediate matter of the suffering animal right before us in reality, moment to moment. And not just one quick blow to the head, but every day as the clock ticks, around the clock, as the lights get shut off, as the fans hum, as the squeals gently squeal in the background, as carts are wheeled by, as smells of blood perpetrate and penetrate the air, the animals endure hour after hour, day after day, under circumstances of prolonged suffering and incarceration. So we are in a circumstance where we have to make a judgment which is not really ours to make, but which we can make cognitively by reason of our minds and the capacity of our minds to reason, that this is great suffering, and what we are doing is inflicting the suffering, whether that's how we see it in our mind or not. That is the immediate event, and that is the decision a person has to make when looking at this. Are we going to cause suffering, torture, and pain, or are we going to leave life alone? Are we going to not dare desecrate life? Are we going to step back and give life its space? Not perhaps its reverence even, but just its space and its right to be free from such harm in perpetuity. That's the very basic, immediate, infallible issue over which we cannot leap forward with rationalizations, over which we cannot leap forward with so-called reasons. And I just give you a quick analogy that if persons who are not registered to be conducting what is known as science are doing things which are in fact identical to what goes on in a laboratory, how the animals are kept, what is done to them and not done to them, and so on, what the environment is all about. In most instances, such persons would be guilty of crimes that could be punishable by law. And yet, when we have the reason of what we call research, we don't consider it in this naked light, and in fact, we don't consider it very much at all. We kind of hide it away, and the industry and establishment that is involved in the research very much does not want an open exposure and free discussion about it. Representatives do come out to discuss, but very often you'll run up against people telling you that they are not allowed to speak by the institutions under which they are governed. Persons who belong in this field of industry. So that is the immediate event. There's nothing beyond it. That's what you have to look at. On the separate issue of medical research, and it is a separate issue because inevitably the question comes up, well, what about medical research? How can we do medical research? Whether we do medical research or not, and whether we should do medical research, and whether the kind of research that we mostly do qualifies as good science, and whether researching even with a good science is the whole or even most logical, direct way to go about being better medically, physically, psychologically, and so on, has nothing to do with animal suffering. Animal suffering is animal suffering, and medicine and how medicine proceeds and how it decides what it's going to do is a whole separate issue. And as an illustrative idea, in a nutshell, I would say as to how separate they are too, one being the decision of whether you make life suffer, and the other being totally unrelated kind of endeavor towards finding out something about the body in certain kinds of ways or about the mind in certain kinds of ways. I would offer you this this little thought, which is that were we to, for example, get to nirvana or a completely undiseased, unperplexed, harmonious state because of doing research, and horrendous it is, research using animals, we would not be able to get there philosophically by what I am telling you. We would not be able to achieve such a condition were it to ever be feasible, which it entirely is not, on the backs of animals. The two are unrelated and separate affairs altogether. One is animals suffering greatly at the hands of humans, period, for whatever reason. The other is using methods and techniques to discover things about the mind and the body. Now, within medicine, how we go about research, what we think are variables that should be looked at as causative factors, how the research is supported, and what the thrust is of the underlying impetuses that give rise to the various kinds of so-called studies that are done, and the extremely fractionated, prolific, and innumerable tidbits of splinters of tiny amounts of information that goes on in what is called research, are not necessarily the most direct and beneficial or logical or obvious way to be proceeding. But yet that's still a whole separate issue about medical research itself, which I will leave for another space and time. The idea of how we are doing research, should we do research, the nature of it, whether it uses animals or not, and how we have outcomes and how much better we're getting with medicine or not, I will leave for another space and time, but I will say whether we do it and thereby use animals has no connection whatsoever in logic, in thinking, in knowing, in our consciousness, if we were to be truthful and look at it nakedly. The one is animal suffering, the other is medical research. And I will say briefly that just in and of itself, in and of the topic itself about research and how we go about it and how healthy we are or are not, no matter what kind of research we do, using humans, using test tubes, using computer models, and so on, and the variables that we look to, like the fat content in our foods, and the fiber in our foods, and the protein in our foods, and the time of day, many variables that seem so so much in the minority as far as their amount of consequence to the overall health and well-being of people, we at the same time seem to be stepping over and missing in medical research some of the grossly obvious things that should be looked at, such as radiation in the atmosphere, added radiation made by human enterprises, and the multitudinous carcinogens, and the kinds of materials that we use that are not good for us, and the stress quotients, and the speed of life, and the lacks of proper kinds of air qualities, etc., which I won't go into. So many very obvious factors that are inimical to human health and welfare are not being looked at squarely and are not being looked at in the whole and in the more organismic, entire, plasmatic, flexible interchange of a picture of what it is to be alive and what you need to be wholesome, alone and together with the rest of life, the rest of humanity, animals, and nature. So that is a whole separate topic, but in sum, I will again point out that what happens to animals and whether they can be used in the manner that they are used is in and of itself the whole question that has to be tackled in anyone giving this some serious thought. And medical research is an entirely separate question. The one doesn't ride on the other whatsoever. That is just a proselytization, a bastardization, a rationalization of the truth. And then within medical research, or research in general, all the kinds of so-called research that is done, even research as all these tiny little fragments of so many simple-minded, minor, trivial, inconsequential, really, in the bigger picture kinds of tidbits of, you can't even call facts, but results that come out, make one wonder if the meaning of knowledge has not eroded greatly indeed. But be that as it may, there certainly are many questions of how do you get to health and welfare for human beings, and is the very intricacy of how it's supposedly done right now the way to even be doing it, let alone the question of using animals, or not even the question, the absolutely non-viable position of hinging the use of animals to the idea of doing research for medicine and biology, etc., the way it is done today. I have an article which I did not bring with me tonight called Recognizing Animal Suffering and Pain, which was published in a couple of journals, and one of them was Lab Animal, which is an industry journal, and in there I delineate how it is that animals suffer and feel pain from both the behavioral, just living experience view, and the physical view. I believe that was published in 1992, and some of you may want to look at that if you are in a library, especially a veterinary library like might be available at Tufts. As I said, I get responses from you through my web address onto email, and I do like to hear that. There's so much coming that I can sometimes not keep up with it these days, because as you can see, once I get started, I have to say everything or I try to say everything precisely just so that there can be no room for interpretation or generalization. So it's kind of hard to be writing a lot of responses, but I love to get messages nevertheless. And please keep them coming. Back to the continuation of the series, this being the third in this particular series on environment and regulation. Environment in this case being our natural environment, the one that Albert Gore wrote a book about some time ago and was greatly criticized for. The environment being our natural environment, including the natural environment of lights on me and the air quality and the materials of the floor and the curtains, etc. around me, the paper that I'm touching, and so on. And in other words, the physical environment, be it natural or man-made. And secondly, a regulation. Regulation being somehow the implicit supervision or explicit supervision, or at least attention to, an awareness of, an incorporation of how we comport ourselves in regards to the environment. And it's unfortunate that we've come to such a point, we've stepped over such boundaries that before were never, or would even never be stepped over by humans conceiving to do that way back when. But we have transgressed such boundaries that we have to actually think of the environment as a thing that we can't transgress. It's too bad it has to be such an obvious point brought out and especially marked and contained as a matter for us to be paying attention to. It should be implicitly much more part of our natural psyche, such that we would never be doing the many things that we do today to hurt our environment and hurt ourselves. And even if we weren't hurting ourselves, it would seem the true mortal sin, if you will, there being, remember, those of you that know something about religion, there being classes of sins: venial sins, cardinal sins, mortal sins. In this case, I'm telling you, it seems to be a mortal sin for a mortal human being in a mortal life to be killing life off, changing it such that it cannot survive, that it is limping, that it is debilitated and sagging and having trouble supporting itself and supporting the life that feeds off of it. That kind of regulation. Of course, we've come to have laws and standards and prescriptions and agencies overseeing what we do, with potential fines for malfeasance and so on. This is all too bad, but that is included in the idea of regulation. And as long as we are a polluting and defecating, ruining kind of agent on this earth, we are having to have some kind of regulatory explicit consciousness, and even, as you know, many agencies. Now, I often bring up some reminders when I begin talking about the environment, because they're smacking us in the face every day. Too many reminders. Some reminders of the many severe and critical, and yet there are so many critical, very egregious kinds of problems or adversities that are afflicting us and the environment. And one of these that that I see go by frequently, one of these kinds of problems and areas of shame, if you will, have to do with genetic engineering and genetically engineered crops. I happen to see a lot of news about that, and I've spoken about this before, and I want to remind you that we now have Roundup, which is a very deadly life killer. Roundup ready corn seeds that have been genetically altered to be more tolerant of the poison Roundup that can kill plant life. And let me tell you something, things which kill plant life that are poisons to the earth and kill creatures such as insects and so on also kill us. They may not kill us as easily or with as little an amount or a similar amount as it does something smaller or more simple, but nevertheless likely has, in most cases has, a toxic effect on us as well. We would never go and ingest some Roundup. In fact, I've not seen a bottle of that lately, but I bet you it comes with some very stark warnings of what not to do with the ingredients of that bottle that are toxic to you. So now there's genetically engineered corn, which is more resistant to having this poison sprayed on it, which means more of it can be sprayed. And that's to, I suppose, kill the weeds around it. More of it can be sprayed and kill the other plant life around it. And yet the corn presumably will still survive, but guess what? Now you're going to have the privilege of eating corn that has been sprayed with even more poison than before because it can tolerate it. Imagine what kind of corn that is. We also have to ask, the question comes to mind at the same time, how do humans ever decide to develop poisons to kill? Because when I think of this Roundup ready corn, I think of those ads where people suffering allergies or ads for Roundups are killing dandelions and other kinds of natural plant life with some kind of toxins that can take care of these things, so to speak. How did we get, or stepping on bugs or spraying, how do we really love to kill? And some commercials show the plant life as being really big and in the way, and we can just kill it. Or Roundup is squirted in this nice little thing facing the sunshine and the rain, coming up from the ground, God's own substance on earth, if you will, and we can develop poisons to kill. We love to kill. We see a spider we want to kill. We develop movies that show how we can kill these things. The killing machine, the human killing machine, the human animal that loves to kill, just to kill. And humans love not only to kill, they love to have sex. Those two things, which brings me back to a Freudian kind of postulate that there were two basic drives in life, the erotic drive and the aggressive drive. The killing drive, if you will, in the most base sense, and the sexual drive in the most broad panoramic sense. But what humans don't very patently and clearly and upfront have is generally a motivation and the drive to love, really love. Humans don't necessarily love to love. They may love to kill, they may love to make sex and so forth, but they don't necessarily love to love. That's what we do not see in large supply as human beings go. Was it Stevie Wonder who said, "Love's in need of love today," and so many songs like that. Put a little love in your heart and so forth and so on. That's in short supply. But killing, Boy, that's in large supply. Then we have what's called BT corn, which is corn that's genetically altered to produce its own toxins against one of the pests that is a problem for farmers of corn, the corn borer, some kind of an insect, I would say. And this corn also happened to kill butterflies. It was found and has been known to kill other species, and I haven't seen the reports of exactly what these other creatures are that this corn can kill. A corn engineered to produce toxins to kill creatures that come on it, as do butterflies apparently come on the tassels of corn for the pollen. Now, the twist on this is, and not a happy one for the chemical companies that have aligned themselves with the agriculture companies in the research dash to be making these products and own the patents and be able to control them more closely and control the market and keep on getting higher prices into the future and have one's hands on the most vital supply of all, the food supply. The twist on this is, for these companies and researchers, that countries around the world are refusing to buy this genetically altered grain. And I guess more are kicking in all the time. Not in the U.S. In the U.S., anything goes. All kinds of products are okay in the U.S. We don't stop to think about that. Whatever we see, whatever's sold, whatever's proposed mostly gets bought in the United States. Mostly for the dollars that the utilitarian purpose and therefore the financial purpose to which it's geared. But the twist is that farmers now in the United States are not accepting the genetically engineered corn because a lot of their business is to export the corn, and that's being refused by many countries. Also, there's a big question of whether supplies have already gotten contaminated between corn that's never been altered and just as Mother Nature's most glorious, beautiful, yellow, succulent, pure, wholesome food mastered by master individual small farmers over decades and centuries who tilled the soil and understood their crop and brought it to better and better fruition. That beautiful corn is getting contaminated with corn that's genetically altered, which could present another problem. How do you keep these things separate in the fields and in the transfer of the pollens and so on? And you know what? Today's modern farmer, though they're not all like this, the big farmers it must be, the agribusiness farmers it must be, were asked why they are not buying this genetically engineered corn, and most said, like I told you, it's because they can't export it. I didn't hear anywhere in the answers surveyed, at least by the reports I read, that some of them would say, because it's wrong, because it's crazy, because it can kill certain kinds of life, and what is it going to do to us? We don't even know. And what happens to this kind of corn over time? Well, suffice it to say that not only corn, but so many things are up for grabs in this country, which is the forerunner of the future now. We are the future now, the forerunner of a technological world, the forerunner of the vast experiment that we are real-life representations of a society that has gone headlong into money at all costs, automatonism, bureaucracy, corporatism, aggregate wealth, value of the dollar above all else, and a kind of chic or motif of always trying to devise a new product, be it an inane product, be it a useless product. Go into a Walmart store and you can see thousands of items that mostly people really don't need when you come right down to it. Variations on themes, of many of which are not really necessary for living, and just a proliferation of so many kinds of products. So we're always now, and as the leaders in this kind of a mindset, other countries following suit as well, thinking of the next new twist, the next new product to sell, the next new way to grab a market, and then behind all of that, ways of controlling and accumulating market power. We even sell fetuses. Yes, we sell fetuses. Fetuses are sold for research, which for those of you out there who may have a pro-life stance, I would think would have a very difficult time imagining that fetuses, even fetuses that legitimately happen perhaps through miscarriage and so on, might be sold as items and used for research. We don't yet sell body parts, but it is getting to that. Remember recently someone put body parts for sale on the internet. I think it happened more than once. They were willing to sell something for money, and in other countries I've heard reports, you've heard reports that this is done. We're selling time on the internet. We're selling time. We're selling water, which we should have all around us and be able to drink freely, and it's costing more and more. We're selling prison labor. We're selling prisoners, their labor. We're selling animals for research. It costs big money for some of the best animals, those poor, hapless souls that end up in laboratories. News is a product. News is a commodity. I heard someone speaking about whether media is left-wing or right-wing, and the person was explaining it's whatever wing makes the most money. And you have to remember that when you see, especially cable shows, coming out with vituperous, motivated speakers that get the audiences riled up and have people calling in and reacting as a consequence, what they're really doing is trying to find the formula. They have to make money trying to find the formula where the money will be the most to be had. So everything's up for grabs. Everything is the dollar. The dollar is God. And humans are kind of a sometimes minor inconvenience behind all this. The idea of whole human beings with hearts and minds and souls and bodies and thoughts and feelings and so on. We're called consumers. We're not humans that breathe and have hopes and aspirations and love life and want to be with each other and connect and relate. No, we're consumers. We're automatonic consumers. We're delineated as things. We're objectified. We are commoditized. We are responsible for this. We ourselves are part of this process. And when I think of us as consumers and the way things go in our country, the United States, I think of another little country called Bhutan up in the area of the Himalayas, where because of their geographic location, people have been able to be sort of isolated and have a very, very natural and sort of old-fashioned existence. And where there's a conscious effort by the people, by the leaders of the people, to keep their society relatively free from the penetration of consumerism and the dollar as the mighty value. So a little piece I saw on this was showing that some tourists, who mostly are not allowed to go there, but some tourists who were there saw some school children and started to give them some of the things that they had, which would be very fancy, shiny, amazing to people that still live in the old mountain way of life up in the Himalayas. And they were told, don't do that. Do not give things to the children, because we don't want people just prostrating themselves to consumerism, to things, to commodities, to objects, to products, to materialism, and getting on a treadmill and value system and motivation that wants to just have more and more products and just lives for that. I'm also thinking of a video recently by NSYNC that I saw, where at the end a girl is in a very fancy convertible car and the guys are in a very fancy convertible car, and they're going on the road in a very dangerous chase, going in and out in very reckless ways. And these beautiful cars are obviously put there by the companies who are the manufacturers. And I'm sure it's making the people think, just the way if you could see the video, making the people think who are fans of NSYNC that this is what you should be, this is what you should have. So that people even get into cars and hijack them, as recently happened with the lady and her child. Even though her car wasn't one of these super fancy, up-to-date cars, I take it. People need it so badly because the conditioning is so intense. Products to sell. Products everywhere. What else? Products. Everything organized into products. Life itself. Yes. Life itself as a commodity and an object. Humans as commodities and objects. Humans as consumers. Humans as resources. And a wholesome life means fewer and fewer commodities. Fewer and fewer commodities means a natural, whole, more wholesome life. And what we have that is being produced and delivered to us as whole and wholesome, as in whole foods, for example, is coming at an ever greater economic or financial price. The price of things, products, commodities that are called whole and natural carry prices, carry price tags that are higher than those things that are considered not to be so wholesome and pure, because of the ironic and controverted twist to the shape that life is taking and has taken. And we're in a trap of generating products. Instead of a society that plays and prays together, connects, relates, has fun, lives, loves, laughs, dies together, we are a producing society, a consuming society, and we as human beings are a dollar value if you will, of per capita expenditure. We are coming towards an end here, so I will see what I can say in closing. I would say that we should change our language. As I said before, we should change our terms. Not as an organized effort or as an agenda or as a prescription or as a script of what we should do. But we should just try to be freer thinkers, freer knowers, freer people just to be, with a genuine meaning to our terms, not one that is prostrated to economic value, financial value, monetary value, mercenary value. And we should regurgitate all the garbage and all the nonsense and all the less than noble, less than potentiated and actualized humanity that is really inside of our breast, deep down in our soul, deep in our heart. And we've got to step back, see the bigger picture, use our brains, use our minds, use our soul, use our collective soul, working on what is mutually beneficial. And we'll not forget, too, that practically speaking, there should be limits to our growth. There should be limits to where we go in non-humanitarian, inhuman, and inhuman ways. And these should be something that we acculturate ourselves to in a process of living more genuinely, instead of as the walking wounded denying the deep down hurt, confusion, and obscurity of what we really could be. And we should have if we can at all, just be more aware and thinking and natural, a more attuneness, awareness. Simple kind of knowledge, understated knowledge that goes without saying, of how to live more naturally, more wholesomely, less objectified, less commoditized, more relating, more humane, more human, more part of ourselves and each other as we are as people, because the most primary thing about us in being alive is our very psychology and fundamental existence and day-to-day livingness and being that we never are separate from, ever, as long as we are alive. That's the biggest reality. As is the glory and wonder of this life that we're part of, that we cannot understand, that is a mystery, and yet which we must find a place in, a harmony with, a balance with, a fit with, a fittedness with, and most of all, a fittedness with each other, away from the toxins, away from the poisons, away from the unrestrained growth and unrestrained devastation on our environment. A kind of self-regulation beyond even the required mundane regulation that we now face, because dear Mother Earth and us are in such very dire straits. Good night to you. Thanks for listening, and be back with you soon.
Remember Neil Young? He said, this old world keeps spinning around. It's a wonder tall trees ain't laying down. There comes a time. Are you headed for the country? Because it's time to go. Neil Young. Look at Mother Nature on the run. Neil Young. How dare we profane the earth? How dare we poison water? How dare we cut down trees? How dare we alter genetics?